Yes.
I'd like to thank the panel. My name is Rania Lesker. I'm completing my doctorate degree here at Part3, and I also teach at the Political Science Department. Oh, thank you. I guess I have an observation, and I'm interested in your opinion, Professor AbuKhalil. I am also sympathetic to your statement about the focus on terrorism as Islamic terrorism and the simplistic and lack of nuance in the field in general. But as someone who is completing a dissertation which includes both human rights norms and security studies, and I would put myself as, or hope to be, a counterterrorism expert, and I'm also Israeli, it seems to me that you first levy this criticism and then you sin in demonstrating the same thing, because your assumption is that all Israeli counterterrorism experts are pro-Israeli, although I hate that term. And I think that in the field of academia and certainly in policymaking, the field is much more nuanced and complex than that. Then you also focus on Israel in a same kind of, I think, a lack of nuance and very simplistic. There is a disproportionate focus on Israel as well. Israel is the only country that can't be a member, eligible to be a member of the UN Security Council. Many of the emergency sessions in the UN in the past 15 years, I think almost all of them, in fact, if I'm not mistaken, have been focused on Israel. Many of the General Assembly resolutions are disproportionately focused on Israel. That is not to take away from the consistent violations of human rights norm and humanitarian law that Israel actually violates in the occupied territories, and it doesn't diminish the grievances of the Palestinian people. But it seems to me that if you want us to have a more nuanced and complex view of the world that we live in today, then you should probably demonstrate that as well here, and I'm not sure that that was the case. So I'm interested in why are you focusing on one country when you're levying the same criticism?
If I read your question correctly, there are two layers. One is about terrorism experts, and one is about singling out what you thought was Israel. On the terrorism expert, no, I think you misquoted me. I did not generalize about all terrorism experts in Israel or elsewhere. I would just make an observation about the infusion of a very disproportionate number. I said infusion of a disproportionate number of pro-Israeli advocates among the terrorism experts. There are many terrorism experts that I cite and I use in my classes. Robert Pape is now, whether he wants it or not, is a terrorism expert, and I use his book in my classes, and I think it's very good and very effective. Ehud Sprinzak's work on the Jewish right in Israel has been, I think, very important. So no, I don't generalize about any group or any people, so certainly I cannot be accused of that, and I didn't say that. So I don't think you're being accurate to what I said. I was just raising some words of caveat about the nature of the field itself, not because of any genetic qualities of people who are in it, but I think the relationship of the terrorism industry and the political knowledge and the temptation to succumb to the general prevalent standards in America, especially after September 11, where dissent is particularly unacceptable and where there is a demand for patriotic academics as well as from everybody else. On the second subject about singling out Israel, of course I did today. I made a particular point to single out the state of Israel because it gets away more than any other state that I know of. I lived half of my life in Lebanon, the other half here in the United States. I am from South Lebanon, so I was very familiar with Israel back home. And then I came here and I see a very different side to Israel that is totally unrecognizable. To my own experience, I do not forget about, but even if you want to forget about the ordeal of the Palestinian people over the years. And it is for that reason, because American audiences are not accustomed to including Israel in any discourse about terrorism, I wanted to do that. And that was my intention. So the first thing was not my intention. The second thing was on purpose.
Yes, sir. Could I just ask again that the questions be as brief as possible so we can get as many in, and direct it to a particular panelist?
I'm Joseph Alroy, born in Palestine but Israeli, and one small correction. Yes, there were a lot of called terrorist acts before the State of Israel, but keep in mind that the leadership in Israel in those time fought against this terrorism, delivered. Some of them have been arrested as a result of the leadership in the country to try to avoid this.
May I say briefly? Well, I mean, I don't know whether they arrested him. I mean, Ishaq Shamir became prime minister. I think it's a very important position in Israel.
Ishaq Shamir was jailed by the British at the time.
He later became prime minister of Israel. Menachem Begin became prime minister of Israel.
It's the opinion today that we made a lot of mistakes, but the leadership at the time, unfortunately, a suicide bomb caused the election of Bibi, and there we have a fallout. So a lot of things, you know, it's not
Thank
a
you.
single thing.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
Hello, my name is Dexter Van Zyla, and I work for the Committee for Accuracy in Middle East Reporting in America, and that may prove decisive for some people. And how.
Question to the panel, and particularly to Professor AbuKhalil, who seemed to distort a little bit what I said yesterday. So, for the record, I'm not an apologist of the Bush administration. I've been very often critical of Israeli politics toward the territories, and I never conflated the concept of Islam with fascism. What I did yesterday, however, was an attempt to explain a certain form of Islamism, which could be any other form of religions, with a historical period, an interwar period, with fascism. So that's to frame, first and foremost, what I said yesterday. You seem to suggest that I was not doing that. What is interesting in this effort is when we distinguish between tactics and ends. The question that we have to keep in mind, even if we are on the side of the underdog, but the goals is anti-human rights, anti-democratics, what do we do? It's a very, very hard question. If we all have a commitment for democracy and human rights, what do we do with those groups, whether they are Muslim, Islamists, not Muslim, and others? And yet, we know that at the end of the day, if they take power, women will not have equal voting rights, for example. So that's one important question that was in between the lines when I was speaking yesterday. And what I was trying to suggest is that it's precisely because it's not Islam that is belligerent that we have to go to see in a different part of history what the West has done in terms of irrationalist ideologies to support visions that are an anti-enlightenment. It's precisely because it's an anti-essentialist argument that we have to go beyond Islam to look similarity and commonality. And it's precisely because of that that we have to seek the answers that were provided at the time to see what we're doing today is correct, flows, or we should simply update it to the new conditions of our days. So I just want to make sure that we're on the same page because I heard those implicit accusations.
Well, I think you confirmed that I did not misunderstand you at all. And I think that I am clear that I did not in any way accuse you of being an apologist of the Bush administration. I don't know where that came from. But on the general subject, certainly, I mean, I think that the objective, the declared objective of democracy in no way changes the quality of violence exercised by a particular group or state. I mean, we've seen in the case of the United States the large amount of civilians killed in Iraq and Afghanistan. Certainly, democracy in the case of the United States has not in any way tempered or restrained the ability of the United States to kill a very large number of civilians in those countries. The second point on the subject of feminism or women's rights and the declared Western concerns for that. In a book by Layla Ahmed, Women and Gender in Islam, she talks about colonial feminism. Colonial feminism refers to the practice by colonial officers in Middle East and Muslim countries in the past, when they used to champion women's rights in Muslim countries, and they themselves used to oppose women's rights in their own countries, and women's enfranchisement. I mean, we remember Lord Cromer in Egypt, how he used to speak about women's rights in Egypt, and he was a declared misogynist back home. I mean, we've seen that in the United States. I mean, we have seen a revival of colonial feminism in the Bush administration, and even by some liberal feminist group like Feminist Majority, who used the issue of women in Afghanistan to cheerlead and prepare the country for war against Afghanistan. And when the case was over, the war was achieved, there was absolutely little attention to what happened to women in Afghanistan. I think there is legitimate concerns about fundamentalism in women. I mean, from my own perspective as a radical feminist, I guess, I would say that there is certainly a threat, but I refuse to think that there is, I mean, we have to recognize the similarities between Jewish, Christian, and Muslim fundamentalism. I think they are, Islamic fundamentalism is not more obscurantist, not more misogynistic, not more sexist, not more anti-secularist than Jewish or Christian fundamentalism. So if one is truly concerned about women's rights, one has to be consistent in fighting against a manifestation of fundamentalism in all these religions. In all these religions.
Yes, ma'am.
My name is Ruth Barris, and I guess I just have a comment, which is maybe somewhat world, and the non-Muslim world for that matter, in terms of popularity of individuals, leaders, and one of them was bin Laden. And in some countries like Jordan and Pakistan, the approval ratings for bin Laden, without any substance of the detail of why there was approval of those individuals, was alarmingly high. Is that because we've boosted his image as a fighter against whatever ideology, or the U.S. or international law? Or is there something, is the support there only paper thin and temporary, or is there something more there? Thank you.
Professor Kretzmer.
That the principles are there and they can be applied if you want to apply them. They're not perfect, but they're better than no principles at all. And what frightens me, I'll be quite honest, and I said so plainly and simply in my talk, is trying to work with a model in which it's claimed there's no law whatsoever and there's no international law, and it's all at the discretion of the head of the state of any country. And then that is what leads to the kind of things like the torture memo and internment of people for years and years and years without any recourse to any court or to any other mechanism for their freedom. And that has to be avoided.
Thank you. Professor AbuKhalil.
Yes, my point on this subject was in fact directed at academics, because I think when you see this disproportionate attention to Al-Qaeda, just as we saw that for Abu Nidal back in the 1980s, and Abu Nidal commanded the support of no more than 200-300 people, like in total, at his heyday. And I worry that in the same sense that we may translate the media and government obsession with bin Laden and Al-Qaeda with appreciation of a political phenomenon that may not exist. I remember after September 11, just anecdotally, I went to Lebanon with the intent purpose of looking for evidence of bin Laden support, and I went to like poor areas, Sunni areas, looked at all the graffitis on the wall, and all throughout that trip after September 11, I found one graffiti, and it says bin Laden. I never encountered anybody in many talks I gave. I spoke at a refugee camp in Burj al-Barajni, and I said something against Taliban. One guy stood up and said, you know, don't criticize the Taliban, and he left. He was mad. So, I mean, you don't see any evidence of any support for Al-Qaeda or these groups in terms of mass support. I think public opinion is a field that is, shrouded with a lot of controversies. There are people like who talk about it in America, like Zahler or Fishkin at University of Texas, Austin. But suffice to say, when people are answering that question, what are they saying? I mean, they are not necessarily saying that they subscribe not even to the horrors of Al-Qaeda, which public opinion surveys show that people were overwhelmingly opposed to September 11 in many Muslim countries, even conducted by American public opinion surveys. But I think they are saying a provocative message. It's like between bin Laden and Bush, that's what they are saying. And certainly, I mean, they are intensely anti-Bush. This is like a Palestinian once was asked by a Washington Post reporter on why some Palestinians displayed support for some tyrant like Saddam Hussein, who never displayed any concern for the Palestinians, just as bin Laden never did in action. And the Palestinian said, he said, look, we are desperate. If the monkey offers support for Palestinians, we support the monkey. And the monkey in this case is either Saddam or bin Laden.
Thank Thank you. There are a number of other questions. I see hands up, but I'm afraid we've already 5 minutes over our allotted time, and we have to leave time for the next panel. Please join me in thanking our distinguished panelists for their participation.